Hey guys, this is VinylicPuma, back with another Borderlands video, and today I'll be going over my tier list for all of the Borderlands 1 Legendaries. Now, before we get into everything, I should mention a couple of things. Borderlands 1 has 58 Legendaries, and like my previous tier lists, our rankings will be F through S, with F being our lowest tier and S being our highest. However, unlike our other tier lists for Borderlands 2 and the pre-sequel, it is worth noting that Borderlands 1 can define legendaries by a wider variety of weapon parts, and because this is the case, the quality of any legendary can vary greatly. With that in mind, my rankings will mostly be based on the quality of the individual parts that make that given legendary, rather than the entire gun itself. After all, a regular bulldog is a lot different from a Carnage bulldog, and a Carnage bulldog is a lot different from a TK's Wave bulldog. Also, and since we've had like goals on all of these legendary tier list videos so far, let's see if we can reach 2,501 likes on this video. If we can reach that goal, you'll be happy to know that you helped save the world, so definitely be sure to smash like on this video if you really want to save the world. But with all of that out of the way, we can finally get started discussing our tiers, and to start, we'll be discussing the F or flub tier. So F tier is reserved for what I would consider to be the worst of the worst as far as legendaries go. Fortunately, there are only 3 of these, which I think can mostly be attributed to the fact that even some of the least desirable legendaries in Borderlands 1 can actually be pretty good, provided they come with good parts. However, I think there are a few legendaries that are truly awful regardless of what parts they spawn with. In particular, the Torgue Redemption Launcher is pretty terrible due in large part to the fact that it consumes 4 ammo per shot and manages to really only deal about 50% more damage than your average Borderlands 1 launcher. This tier also contains the Hydra, which despite being an Atlas weapon and having good stats, is utterly ruined by its horizontal projectile spread that makes hitting enemies with all those pellets nearly impossible. And then there's the Iridian Mega Cannon, which despite being better than the Iridian Cannon, is still just bad due to its long recharge times, slow fire rates, and minuscule damage output. Ultimately, I think you'll find that you can find better legendaries in Borderlands 2 than any of these 3 we've just discussed. Maybe you could use these for fun, or you could sell them to a vendor if you needed some quick cash, but beyond that, I wouldn't use them if you're looking to put together any serious build for your characters. In a weird way, the same thing could be also said of many E-tier legendaries as well. Now, while E-tier legendaries are usually better than what you might find in the flub tier, and some can be average with good parts, I think you'll find that all 5 of these E-tier legendaries are generally lacking and somewhat flawed. A great example of this is the Butcher, which has a low projectile count that ultimately ends up lowering the shotgun's damage potential and ends up crippling the strength of the gun, which is its burst fire capability. You also have the Wildcat, which despite its improved magazine size, gets reduced accuracy, which ends up making the SMG far less accurate, even with ideal parts. After that, there's the Gasher, which has good damage, but unfortunately is burst fire with terrible accuracy and recoil. There's the Iridian Firebomb, which despite its decent fire damage potential, has a ridiculously low fire rate and long recharge time. And then there's the Iridian Stampeding Splatter, which is basically a corrosive version of the Iridian Firebomb that possesses many of the same flaws. I suppose if I wanted to be cute, I could call this tier the Iridian tier, since Iridian weapons in general tend to be pretty awful in Borderlands 1. However, I will say that I do think most of these weapons could be great if a lot of their weird penalties or flaws were removed. After all, an accurate Gasher or a high projectile count Butcher might actually be pretty decent. But it's now time we talk about our D, or perhaps more accurately, our D4 degree tier. To be honest, I would consider most of these legendaries to be acceptable. However, many of these are either pretty lame or in 2 out of 7 cases are actually borderline C tier, but just didn't end up making the cut for C tier. As far as the former case goes, I would say the Troll is the embodiment of lame, since one of these isn't really that bad with decent parts. However, the reason you would want to use one of these things is for its special effect, which ends up being a fairly lame and fairly weak healing effect. Thus, you could probably use really any other legendary repeater pistol within Borderlands 1 and potentially end up having something that's just better. Similar things can also be said of things like the Mongol and Rhino, which are rocket launchers with special effects that are sort of impractical. After all, one requires all the enemies you shoot at to be in a straight line, while the other requires the maximum distance so you can get enough rockets to spawn to deal the most damage. There's also the Raven, which doesn't really have much going for it other than it can fire a 5-round burst, while the Surkov has okay fire rate and reload speed, but ends up losing out in the accuracy department compared to other legendary snipers. This leaves us with our borderline entries, which are the Violence and Mugshot. Honestly, I feel kind of bad making either of these D tier since both are actually pretty good early on, but it is worth noting that both have fixed parts and are often outperformed by other better legendary revolvers and combat rifles later on in the game. This, I would say, is more the case with the Violence since high-end revolvers can be massively more powerful, but even in the case of the Mugshot, I think you'll find some of the more high-end combat rifles tend to be better as well. Overall, though, most of the weapons that are in D tier aren't especially bad or anything, but I do think they do come up short when compared to some of our C tier legendaries, which, speaking of which, it's about time we discussed some of those. To what is likely no one's surprise, C tier contains legendaries that are average, and most legendaries end up fitting within this particular tier. Now, while a C grade might not be that desirable for your paper or grade in school, keep in mind that your average legendary in Borderlands 1 is actually pretty good, and will end up being much better than any other weapons that you might come across. For that reason, many of these weapons should end up being pretty awesome despite not being quite as amazing as things in B tier and up. I'd say most of the TDR legendaries like the Guardian, Defender, and Equalizer fit really well in this tier, as all three have great ammo regen abilities, but aren't quite as powerful as some of the higher end legendaries. Similar things could be said of guns like the Destroyer, which has a good special effect but isn't quite as amazing as some of the better combat rifles. The Maliwan Crux, which has decent proc chance but doesn't have an accessory that fully negates its damage penalty. The Friendly Fire, which has decent damage but poor range. The Cyclops, which has accuracy issues despite having really great scope zoom. And then of course there's the Rebel, which has overall nice stat boosts but largely seems to come up short against many of the better repeater pistols that are out there. I'd also consider the Chimera and Revolution to be firmly C tier as well. Again, neither of these legendaries are bad per se, but in the case of the Chimera, it just isn't quite as amazing as some of the better revolvers, due in part to its multi-elemental effect. In the case of the Revolution, it just isn't quite as great as some of the better support machine guns due to its lower rate of fire. Again, none of these legendaries are particularly bad or anything, it's just that I tend to prefer some of the other legendaries from higher tiers. I've also decided to include a number of borderline legendaries that can go in both directions. As far as what legendaries skew towards D tier, I'd say the Invader Sniper is a little less desirable in my opinion, though I will admit I'm not a huge fan of burst fire on my snipers. Other than this one legendary though, I'd say everything else could potentially scale up to B tier, as things like the SNS Crux, the Violator, the Volcano, the Gemini, the Thanatos, and the weapon that's name is Too Hot for YouTube are actually pretty great. These borderline C tier legendaries are worth seeking out and can prove to be great alternatives to the legendaries that are in B tier and above. Thus, and again, just because a legendary appears in C tier doesn't mean that it's bad. In the end, C tier is filled with mostly good legendaries that should prove to be better than most of the generic weapons that you can come across. But if you're looking for something that's a bit better, it might be a good idea to look into some B tier legendaries. Though not our most prestigious tier, B tier features legendaries that I would consider to be above average as far as legendaries go. Many of the legendaries that are featured here are great to get your hands on, and while some of them aren't quite as impressive as what appears in the A and S tiers, many of these are still very high quality. Legendaries like the Anaconda, which is a very powerful revolver, the Reaper, which allows your melee strikes to heal you, the Nidhogg, which fires rockets that split after a certain distance, and even the Baja's Bigger Blaster are in this tier thanks to the fact that they're pretty great quality legendaries. Some other legendaries that are notable are things like the Striker, the Skullmasher, the Cobra, the Draco, and the other legendary that's name is too hot to be said on YouTube. Many of the other weapons that got included in B tier are capable of having hybrid variants. 3 legendaries that would have normally been C tier, which are the Hornet, Savior, and Protector, ended up making B tier for this reason, as the Hornet gains infinite ammo when it melds with the Dove, the Savior can meld with the Bone Shredder to allow a projectile multiplier, and the Protector can mold with the Chiquito Amigo, which is known for its high fire rate and magazine size. There's also the Bulldog, which also has a hybrid variant, though I suppose it's worth noting that its melding with the TK's Wave Shotgun kinda sucks. However, since the Bulldog's effects come from its unique magazine, you can get Carnage barrels to spawn on these, thus allowing you to have a 20-round rocket launcher. So I think you'll find that in the end, everything ends up working out for the Bulldog. Ultimately, everything in B tier is pretty good. While these items aren't necessarily A tier, many of them are still pretty fantastic and worth picking up if you come across them. Speaking of A tier though, it's about time we discussed A tier legendaries. As one might guess, the A or Awesome tier consists of some of the very best legendaries in Borderlands 1. While these weapons aren't the best weapons of their respective weapon types, many A-tier legendaries are so good that you're not really going to care whether they're the best weapons of their respective types or not. There are 9 legendaries that I think are worthy of being in this tier, and they include the Hammer, the Sucker Punch, the Invader Pistol, the Firehawk, the Vengeance, the Penetrator, the Hellfire, the Silent Knight, and the Defiler. In the case of many of the elemental weapons I've just mentioned, many of these legendaries either have no damage penalty or actually provide a damage boost based on their unique accessories. This makes these legendaries substantially stronger than normal variants, and when you add some of their special effects into the mix, such as the Hellfire's near guaranteed proc chance, you'll find these weapons can be extremely powerful. As for the other legendaries that I just mentioned, many of them tend to provide extraordinary effects. For example, the Sucker Punch sports the highest melee damage bonus of any gun, the Vengeance can allow your shots to bypass shields without Mordecai's Trespass skill, and the Penetrator is a fully automatic sniper rifle, capable of monstrous fire rate and damage. I think you'll agree the vast majority of legendaries that appear in A tier are awesome. Any of them can be great choices provided you pair them with the right build, so you should definitely take the time to get your hands on them provided the opportunity arises. This of course leaves us with our final tier, which is S tier. As alluded to when discussing A tier legendaries, S tier legendaries tend to be the best weapons of their respective types, surpassing the rest of what Borderlands 1 has to offer. We have 4 legendaries here, which include the Jacob's Unforgiven Revolver, the SNS Orion Sniper Rifle, the Atlas Ogre Combat Rifle, and the Gearbox Hivemind Launcher. Of the 4, probably the weakest one here is the Hivemind, since it isn't quite as crazy as the other 3, but it does have fairly high base damage and burst fire capability, which does make it a pretty good option for Brick. After that, you have the Orion, which is fantastic for its ricochet potential that spawns 3 projectiles from one shot. There's the Unforgiven, which when paired with the Masher accessory is extremely powerful and super lethal against Chromarax. And finally, you have what is possibly the cream of the crop, which is the Ogre. Normal Ogres are generally pretty powerful and are easily A tier. However, the Ajax Ogre, which combines the Ogre's accessory with the Ajax Spear Combat Rifle, is absolutely monstrous. This variant is the pinnacle of legendaries in Borderlands 1 as it combines low recoil, high fire rate, and high accuracy with the high damage potential of the Ogre accessory, thus ensuring you have an almost perfect combat rifle. But again, even if you don't get the Ajax Ogre, normal Ogres are generally pretty good since they're from Atlas, which usually supply very high quality weapons. At the end of the day, I think you'll agree that our S tier entries are among some of the best weapons, let alone legendaries in Borderlands 1. All of them are very desirable, even if some of them are much harder to get than others. Alright guys, I think that's going to wrap up this particular video. If you enjoyed this video, definitely be sure to smash like, click the bell so you can be notified when I upload my next Borderlands video, and as always, and again, thank you all so much for supporting this channel. take care, and I'll see you all in the next one.